Dzień dobry, znajdujemy się w Centrum Historii Zajezdni.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you from the Depot Center in Wrocław. Welcome to the second day of our conference organized by the Remembrance and Future Center, the University of Wrocław, and the Wrocław branch of the Institute of National Remembrance. What we have in store for you is 5 panels. Today, the first is going to be moderated by Jana Wojden. Thank you.
Since we are already late, I will skip the introduction and will invite immediately Maximilian Lord Hill from Durham University in the United Kingdom, who is going to present the paper Ancient Polish Lands, Narratives of Polskość in the Silesian Museum in Wrocław, 1948-1956. The mic is yours. And please try to keep the
Dziękuję bardzo I dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm a doctoral student at Durham England University. I'm interested in how history was interpreted and presented during the communist times of Poland, and my research focuses on museums that are obviously key places, key venues where society gets involved into the past. However, I shall continue in English. It's going to be easier to me, and I hope that's okay with you. So, let's go.
Narratives of Polskość in the Silesian Museum in Wrocław, 1948 to 1956. Now, as a lot of studies have shown, the process of incorporating the so-called reclaimed lands into the Polish state following its post-war territorial shift westward was difficult and, for many, deeply traumatic. Despite the mass movement of people in the later 1940s, formerly German territory could not be made Polish by merely expelling the population and replacing it with Polish settlers. The new inhabitants had to truly feel that they lived on Polish soil. Yet, as Gregor Tum has observed, post-war settlers arriving in Lower Silesia from central and eastern Poland found themselves confronted by a landscape which seemed distinctly alien and un-Polish. Tum refers to this as the Impermanence Syndrome, and of course it was difficult for many people to put down roots in this situation. German Breslau might now be Polish Wrocław, but it still felt foreign. And this sense of unfamiliarity, compounded by a lack of faith in the durability of the new Polish-German frontier, made it difficult for Polish settlers to see their new surroundings as truly home. How to overcome this problem and join region to nation? This paper, which focuses on Lower Silesia, and Wrocław in particular, between the late 1940s and the mid-1950s, which I think you could refer to as the formative period of the post-war state, considers the issue by exploring the cultural and historical narratives presented in post-war Silesia's preeminent museal institution, the Silesian Museum in Wrocław. Poland's new rulers understood that in order to graft formerly German regions onto the Polish state, it was necessary to show that they were more than just compensation for Poland's territorial losses to the east. It had to be proved that these provinces were genuinely Polish lands, the acquisition of which was to be regarded as a matter of national pride. Doing so required the promotion of particular interpretations of regional culture and history, with museums serving as key sites for their wider transmission. As Graham Black has pointed out, museums are places where history is selected, constructed, and transmitted. And since the emergence of the so-called new museology in the 1980s, a growing body of theoretical literature has sought to foreground the connection between museums and the exercise of cultural and political power. Now, I should say that I don't fully agree with all the literature that's been produced with this new museology. A lot of it draws on Foucault and kind of situates the museum as part of his disciplinary complex, which I think is probably going a little bit too far. And it perhaps also ignores the fact that people engage with museums in personal and different ways. They're not sort of inert monads that wander through, guided by the displays. But nonetheless, museums have deep cultural and political significance. According to Carol Duncan, to control a museum means precisely to control a community and some of its highest, most authoritative truths. The museum under discussion here opened as the State Museum in Wrocław in July 1948, but it was renamed the Silesian Museum in 1950. In 1970, it was elevated to the rank of National Museum, the title which it retains to this day, and of course, it is one of Wrocław's main attractions. It's housed within an imposing neo-Renaissance structure in the city centre, a former local government building dating from the later 19th century. And its core collection was, well, initially made up of kind of a hodgepodge of different artifacts, including artifacts salvaged from the heavily damaged museal collections of pre-war Breslau, but also supplemented by cultural goods recovered from Polish Lwów following its transformation into Soviet Lviv. This was in itself a very complex process. There was a lot of negotiation that led to these artifacts eventually arriving in Wrocław. And also, in the 1940s already, archaeological digs were starting, many of which were led by staff from the museum, so they were already bringing in new artifacts and enlarging and adding to their displays. According to the Ministry of Culture and Art, the museum was to serve as the main museal institution in Silesia, and its primary task was the collection, storage, research and dissemination of material manifestations of Polish and foreign culture in Poland. But it placed a particular emphasis on the role of Polish culture in Silesia. The Silesian Museum thus sought to explicitly foreground the connection between region and nation, and its displays were intended to act as a kind of cultural glue with which to bind the two together. Now, the overriding theme which permeated the museum's exhibitions in those early years was that of Silesia's Polskość, Polishness. As Marta Grzechnik has pointed out, the name given to Poland's new western territories in post-war Polish propaganda, Ziemie odzyskane, reclaimed lands, was a narrative in itself. For these lands to have been reclaimed, they had to have been lost in the first place, which was the crux of the legitimating narrative propagated by the communist state. A millennium before, the Piast dynasty had ruled over a territory which roughly coincided with Poland's post-war borders. Now, the communists evoked the memory of the Piasts as founders of the Polish state in order to legitimate the nation's new borders. In so doing, they built upon the pre-war intellectual tradition of Myśl Zachodnia, or Western thought, which was the Polish counterpart to German Ostforschung. Though it had previously been associated with Roman Dmowski's right-wing National Democrats, it was now embraced by the communists, who turned to nationalism in their quest for legitimacy. Now, I think it has to also be pointed out that this nationalist turn was basically a pragmatic move. It wasn't a complete, volte-face in communist ideology. There were many people high up in the party who would have liked to see Poland become another republic of the Soviet Union. It was merely a means to an end, securing power and buying a certain degree of acceptance. And it was still very suspicious of many of the main exponents of Western thought. For example, Zygmunt Wojciechowski, who, a one-time friend of Roman Dmowski and one of the main figures associated with Western thought, though he was used by the communists to produce propaganda publications that would support what they wanted, he was also followed by the secret police and regarded as a very suspicious individual. Now, reinterpreting Silesian history in order to emphasize its status as an ancient Polish land was an important part of the post-war nation-building process. And the Silesian Museum brought people face-to-face with this new past. A visitor to the museum in the mid-1950s would be able to take in a series of permanent exhibitions which, together, formed a connected historical narrative that stretched from the dawn of humanity until almost the present day. If our imaginary visitor took a chronological approach, they could start at the Prehistory of Silesia exhibition, which, according to contemporary promotional material, was intended to show that Silesia was Polish soil by documenting the fact that Silesian land had been inhabited by Slavs since time immemorial. Over 1,000 archaeological artifacts told the story of the region's prehistoric past, alongside a wealth of maps, photographs, and models. Throughout, the emphasis lay on displaying Silesia's ancient Polskość. Silesia, the exhibition's 1954 guidebook declared, was a prehistoric Slavic land, and the exhibition's narrative stressed the continuous presence of an autochthonous Slavic population on Silesian soil. I'm sure I don't have to point out to you all that this is sort of ahistorical and rather problematic approach, but at the time it was based on thinking which was current. If we think of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century as an age of nationalism, and really this is the period when both museums, the modern public museum as we understand it starts to emerge, and also archaeology develops as a discipline, and they're both quite bound up with the development of nationalism as well. So it was normal thinking, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, that one could ascribe particular national or ethnic groupings to prehistoric people based on archaeological evidence. This was a technique pioneered by a German archaeologist called Gustav Cassini, called it settlement archaeology. But his approach was accepted widely, and Polish scholars also took that approach, although, of course, they had a rather different opinion about who lived in these lands in the past than Cassini and his followers. By emphasizing the Proto-Slavic population of prehistoric Silesia, the exhibition also sought to highlight connections between the reclaimed lands and the territories to the east, which had been part of the pre-war Polish state. According to the 1954 exhibition guidebook, which spoke of the historical ties which bound the land between the Oder and the Wisła in one whole, the artifact on display apparently proclaimed Silesia's cultural unity with the rest of the Polish lands. Moreover, the epic temporal scope of the exhibition, spanning from the Neolithic period up to the 11th century, allowed visitors to connect these ancient proto-Slavs with the more recognizable Poland of the Piasts. Indeed, the exhibition actually concluded with a map of Poland in the later 10th century, which bore more than a passing resemblance to the frontiers of the post-war Polish state. Moving forward through time into the high medieval, our visitor would find the Piasts were well represented within the museum. If our imaginary visitor had visited at some point before 1954, their next stop might very well be the Gallery of Medieval Art. Here, amongst sculptures, paintings, and triptychs, lay two of the museum's star exhibits: the tombs of the Silesian Piast dukes Henry II, who died in 1241, and Henry IV, who died in 1290. The tombs, which dated from the 14th century, took pride of place within the exhibition, and because the former occupants of both tombs had also served as Dukes of Kraków, they further served to symbolically bind Silesia to the rest of Poland. According to a 1953 article in the Warsaw magazine Świat, which was entitled The Silesian Museum, Museum of Polishness, both dukes were said to have thought on a national scale and held hopes of uniting all the Polish lands under one crown. And of course their goal, minus the crown, had been achieved by the communists after the war. The Gallery of Medieval Art was organised along chronological lines, though as an art exhibition the emphasis was on the objects themselves rather than on the construction of a continuous historical narrative. And it's not until 1954, when the 10 Centuries of Silesia exhibition opened, that the museum could present its visitors with a completely uninterrupted narrative from prehistory up to the end of the Second World War, actually. Now, this exhibition was lavishly illustrated. It had over 740 exhibits, it had coins, seals, weapons, models depicting agricultural and industrial practices, and the exhibition spanned the period from the 10th up to the 20th centuries. It thus dovetailed rather neatly with the prehistory of Silesia, because the new exhibition began with the exact same map that the old exhibition concluded with, and thus it allows the narrative of Silesia's Polskość to be extended through time. For the earlier part of the exhibition, this wasn't perhaps a particularly challenging task. The ubiquitous Piasts could be relied upon to supply evidence for the region's Polish identity, while lower down the social scale, attention was drawn to the Polish names of Silesian peasants. Economic ties between Silesia and the rest of Poland were also highlighted. the exhibition claimed that coins minted by the Silesian Piasts apparently played the role of a nationwide Polish currency, serving as, quote, further proof of the Polishness of Silesia, while maps displayed trade routes which connected Silesia with Poland until the middle of the 14th century. While perhaps they were certainly over-egging it and perhaps drawing some conclusions that maybe the evidence didn't support, at this point it wasn't as hard. It's after the middle of the 14th century that sustaining this narrative becomes particularly problematic. Piast rule came to an end in the mid-14th century. The exhibition claimed that the region had fallen from Poland, but Silesia still, of course, had to be presented as Polish. So, henceforth, the exhibition's task would be to sustain this narrative of Polskość through the subsequent centuries of Bohemian, Habsburg, and Prussian rule, in order to set the stage for, quote, Silesia's return to the motherland after the Second World War. Following the contours of post-war Polish historiography, the emphasis shifted from dynastic history to cultural and economic connections, which, it was argued, continued to tie Silesia to the rest of Poland. Numerous documents in Polish were produced to attest to the national identity of early modern Silesian citizens, and in particular peasants, who were said to have retained their Polskość through the centuries, while Silesian trade supposedly testified to the lively economic connections with the rest of the Polish lands. Art and architecture was also drawn upon. Apparently, according to the exhibition, art and architecture in Silesia bore hallmarks of Polish culture, and despite the repressive actions of Silesia's foreign rulers, the exhibition claimed that its Polskość endured. And it advanced on through the centuries, encompassing the turbulent events of 1848 and the Silesian uprisings of 1919 to 21, concluding with Silesia's liberation in 1945. And I'm sure you can all see that there's several problematic aspects to this narrative as well, including things like the Silesian uprisings in an exhibition which is ostensibly about Lower Silesia, kind of blurs the lines a little bit. Where there's not enough evidence for Polskość in Lower Silesia, then evidence is pulled in from Upper Silesia, but it's just referred to generally as Silesia. In fact, there was actually a memorial to the martyrs of the Silesian uprisings at the end of the exhibition, so it had a strong emotive content as well. And though it's something which I'm not really discussing in the course of this presentation, the 10 Centuries of Silesia exhibition had a much stronger ideological component than, for example, the prehistory of Silesia or exhibitions which had come before. Now, of course, ideology was an inescapable part of the Stalinist era, but the earlier exhibitions, like the prehistory of Silesia, they paid lip service to a certain extent to ideology, but they didn't go into the same level of detail, whereas the 10 Centuries of Silesia exhibition maps ethnic conflict onto class conflict. So it presents a story whereby the Germans are always the ruling classes and later the capitalists, and Poles are always peasants or working classes. So any kind of class struggle is also an ethnic struggle between Poles and Germans, and this has gone on throughout the centuries. It wasn't even a new idea. If you think back to the 1948 exhibition in Wrocław about the reclaimed lands, there was a historical component to that which took in the 10 Centuries of Silesia. And Wojciechowski famously wrote a book, 10 Centuries of Struggle, about Polish-German history. So this was something which was quite current. Now, the Polonocentric vision of Silesia's history, which our imaginary visitor has just taken in, is the most obvious and important way in which the Silesian Museum sought to bind region to nation. It's not, however, the only means by which to achieve this objective. Though primarily concerned with Silesian matters, the museum's remit encompassed broader manifestations of Polish culture, which meant that Polish heritage from beyond Silesia also had a role to play. If our visitor were to stop by the museum's other major gallery, the Gallery of Polish Painting, they would see a collection of Polish art dating from the late 18th century to the present day. Though the vast majority of the paintings had little or no collection with Silesia, many of them had been brought from Lwów, the presence of works by famous artists such as Artur Grodger or Jan Matejko gave a welcome boost to the museum's patriotic credentials. While the other exhibitions sought to foreground Silesia's age-old Polskość, the works on display in the Gallery of Polish Painting served to bring more modern manifestations of national culture into the region, with temporary displays devoted to figures such as Mickiewicz in 1949 to 50, Słowacki again in 1950, and Chopin in 1954, also contributing to this process. Now, of course, these people had nothing really to do with Silesia. I think the Słowacki exhibition made reference to the fact that he may have once spent the night in Breslau, but really it was a tenuous link at most. They were there to serve as transmitters of Polskość, of Polish culture, and to bring culture in from outside to help with this process of attaching region onto nation. Now, it is, I think, sadly rather easy for modern observers to take a somewhat condescending attitude, considering the way that history was presented in the Silesian Museum's core exhibitions during those early years. From a strictly historical perspective, it's aged rather badly. Few scholars today, for example, would argue that national identities can be attributed to prehistoric people, while medieval loyalties are now understood to be structured around dynastic rather than ethnic ties. Moreover, the museum's teleological and often ahistorical approach to the Silesian past clearly served the interests of Poland's communist rulers, helping to sell the geopolitical consequences of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. Nonetheless, it would be unfair to be too critical of the museum's activities. As I mentioned earlier, ideology was an inescapable part of life in the Stalinist era, but even so, the museum's employees were no simple propagandists. The story of Silesia's Polskość wasn't merely a communist creation. It may now appear dated, but the narrative was based on ideas which were current at the time and made sense, and was also reinforced by widely accepted scholarship. It built on the pre-war legacy of Western thought, and the region's new history had both deeper intellectual foundations and broader appeal. Just as a stopped clock tells the time right twice a day, so too were there moments in Stalinist Poland where the attitude, or perhaps the needs of the authorities, overlapped to a certain extent with wider society. More than 1 million people visited the Silesian Museum between 1948 and 1956, and of course, the vast majority of them were new inhabitants of the region. For them, the vision of Silesia's past that they encountered within the museum's walls was not empty propaganda, but rather a reassurance that this territory might truly be called home. Now, of course, the museum has changed considerably since then. Once a generation had been born and grown up on Silesian soil, the need to tell this kind of story and to reinforce the region's Polskość receded. And nowadays, if you visit the museum, though you can still see these fantastic tombs of the Silesian Piast dukes, you're not being constantly bombarded with a story of the region's Polskość. But I think that in those early years, the museum played a very important role in making this place home for the many different people who came from all over Poland. And so I don't think we should be too critical when we consider the way that they presented the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So my proposal is to postpone the discussion after the second presentation. And now I would like to invite Dr. Cecilia Molesini from the University of Venice and not Padua. Yes, and so Dr. Molesini will tell us about the forced migration and integration of Silesian expellees in West Germany, the case of a small emotional community.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thanks. I'm very happy to be here because this is my first conference after this 2-year lockdown, so in presence, and so I'm very, very happy. This presentation is a part of a broader research work that I conducted in the last 4 years for my PhD thesis, whose aim was to analyze the emotional aspects of Germans' expulsion from Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia, and their integration into West Germany after World War II. With the purpose of giving a bottom-up perspective of these events and hearing the voices of the protagonists themselves, I applied the methodology of the history of emotions to analyze expellees' personal documents, such as correspondences, diaries, and memoirs. For this occasion, however, I would like to focus on the case study of a small Protestant community hailing from Geibsdorf. Today, so this is the name in Polish today. I will not pronounce it because I don't want to make errors, and so. And mainly, they were integrated into West Germany. So, in order to shed light on the emotional universe that characterized this community, I analyzed a particular kind of source, namely the circular letters, in German Rundbriefe, that the evangelical pastor of Geibsdorf, Hans Saalfeld, sent to his parishioners for many years after their expulsion, so till 1973, as well as their replies. These sources are kept in the Central Archive of the Evangelical Church in Berlin, and they are very interesting for historical analysis, I think, because they act as a bridge between the public and the private spheres. As a matter of fact, their analysis revealed emotional factors and social practices that influenced and conditioned the integration of many expellees into West Germany. In particular, we will see how Pastor Saalfeld's ability and effort to keeping the community together through its letters played a supportive and comforting role in overcoming expellees' loss, as they would say, of their place of origin, as well as in their adapting to the West German context. So, let's talk about this evangelical community of Geibsdorf. The village of Geibsdorf had 2,450 inhabitants in 1945. Administratively, it was part of the district of Lauban. However, it constituted a separate parish. After World War II, most of its citizens were resettled into the new borders of Germany, and just a few could stay in Silesia. Besides the common people, churches and their representatives too had to leave the region and represented an important point of reference for many expellees who had lost almost everything and were often separated from their relatives. Here you can see a picture of Pastor Saalfeld and then a picture of the evangelical church and the cemetery and this illustration of the church of Geibsdorf. In this situation, the community's pastor Hans Saalfeld, who himself had to leave Geibsdorf and found hospitality in Ingolstadt in Bavaria, he had an essential role because through the sending of this Rundbriefe, he kept in touch with these expelled parishioners and collected their new addresses. Saalfeld was not the only pastor who used these means to keep his community together, but his correspondences with his parishioners was so rich and continuous that provides an amazing view of their emotional life and perception of the flight, expulsion, and integration into the new societies. So I would like to talk about the role of these circular letters in the creation of the emotional community. In the first years after the end of World War II, the Rundbriefe were a useful means to draw up lists of survived, missing, and dead people, and for families to find reunite. Therefore, the first circular letters mainly contained long lists of contacts, enquiries from mothers or wives about the fate of their husbands and children, as well as prayers and encouragement to deal with the difficult post-war and displacement situation. However, when time went by, they increasingly assumed a significant symbolic and emotional value for the expellees. This is demonstrated by multiple factors. After the first chaotic years, the structure of the pastor's letters changed to become a proper means to overcome the consequences of the first migration, as well as to make the expellee community feel united. Since 1950s, indeed, the Rundbriefe were largely dedicated to reflections on difficulties involved in integrating into the new social and religious community, such as finding an accommodation, a job, dealing with the residents, and adapting to the local religious liturgies. Indeed, most of the expellees in West Germany were resettled into rural villages, where a true clash of cultures took place. They spoke different dialects, belonged to different confessions, and in general they had different customs and traditions as compared to the local population. Moreover, the idea that temporary refugees would become permanent expellees became increasingly evident and exacerbated the difficult relations between these two groups. So the importance of the letters in expellees' life is particularly evident from their replies, where they shared their emotions while waiting for the Rundbrief, as in this example. And I quote, when the Heimatbrief arrives, then everything else is forgotten. Or, it is always a great event, and it is always a particular joy when we receive news from our Geibsdorf's community. So these are excerpts of expellees' letters quoted by Pastor Saalfeld himself in his 17th Gemeindebrief in November 1952. So during the 1950s, there were still many expellees, German expellees, hoping to return to Silesia or at least to maintain a connection to it. In the following extract, for example, a man wrote how he hoped to bring his wife to the next community meeting. So his wife was not from Geibsdorf. And he said, so that she can get to know the real coziness of Geibsdorf, because I hope that sooner or later we could all return to our Heimat. I will not translate Heimat because, although here there are many beautiful villages too, it still remains a foreign country to us. I always say to my wife, the place where, as child, you tear your trousers for the first time, there is your home. Some other letters show an ambivalent attitude. On one side, the desire to look forward and restart a new life in West Germany, and on the other side, the persistent idea that they will always be connected to their place of origin. So the combined desire both to integrate into the new society and to preserve the link with the homeland characterized the attitude of most expellees during the 1950s. In this complicated phase, the role of pastors as reference and support figures was fundamental. Circular letters often represented the protected places where expellees could address issues and questions that were often not addressed publicly, as well as share emotions, expectations, and worries about their future. So nostalgia, sorrow, and regret often fill expellees' letters, but the desire to move on and start again also played a significant role, as we can read from this quotation. From our side, I can say that everything is going well. In our small place, we have a household, which is just ours. We got all these things through effort and diligence, although at the beginning we had to overcome hard times. God always gave us the new strength to live. Often we are caught by nostalgia for our beloved Heimat and by melancholy for what we have lost. Will we go back again? We still have a sparkle of hope. Moreover, the Rundbrief has also had a specific organizational function. They were used by Pastor Saalfeld to organize the annual community meetings that represented a way to meet friends and neighbors from the place of origin. In the case of Geibsdorf's community, these Heimattreffen were held once a year from 1950 to 1965, but probably even later, in Osterode, a city in the Harz region that connects Lower Saxony, Saxony, and Thuringia, where most of the expellees from Geibsdorf had been resettled. So these meetings were very significant moments for them because, but also for the pastor himself, who was very attached to his community. For example, he had a personal notebook in which he recorded those who attended the meetings and left offerings for the community. However, his attachment to the community was also evident from his comments on the participation, or rather the lack of participation, of some former fellow citizens in community meetings in the 1960s. In a circular letter of 1967, for example, he wondered why some of those living near Osterode, where the former citizen of Geibsdorf used to meet, did not show up at the meeting, while others traveled all over the country, facing long journeys and high expenses to be present. At the same time, however, he was also positively surprised by those who went to the meeting for the first time in the late 60s. As a matter of fact, although the number of participants in the meetings declined more and more from the 1960s onwards, mainly due also to the death of older members of the community, some continued to attend the meetings and leaving increasingly large offers, also thanks to the improvement of their economic conditions. So here you can see a newspaper article about the third meeting of Geibsdorf inhabitants in 1953 in Osterode. The diligence and constancy that characterized Pastor Zalfeld's work of caring for his congregation demonstrate the importance the former community had also in his own search for a role in the new society. In 1957, he wrote, and I quote, "The echo of the letters I receive is still so strong that I feel like I should keep on sending them as long as I have strength and time." And finally, in his last circular letter, he shared with his parishioners some reflections on his role inside their community. I quote, "But after all, it is very unimportant whether I am still legally the pastor of Geibsdorf. In fact, I am. The letters from the community, published about quarterly since the spring of 1947, prove it. The Geibsdorf's meeting prove it. We held the 24th in Osterode this year. Every year, great sacrifices are made to be present on this day of meeting." So, some concluding thoughts. I think that the evangelical community of Geibsdorf is a specific case study that shows some common strategies developed by Protestant pastors to provide emotional and spiritual support to German expellees which had to cope with the abandonment of their place of origin. The practices of sending out circular letters and holding regular meetings enabled the former community to feel united over the years, despite their distance, and to maintain a connection with their past, without renouncing to the construction of a future in the new social reality in West Germany. The fact that over the years some expellees actively participated in the meetings, leaving offerings to ensure the reception of these Rundbriefe, indicates the need and the desire of some expellees to feel part of that small emotional community. At the same time, this practice, the practice of sending letters, was also a way for some pastors, such as in the case of Hans Zalfeld, to find their own role in the new society. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now there is some time for discussion. There is no room for the presenters here, so I hope you will be able also to answer from the place where you are seated. There are not so many of us here. So I'm opening the floor for questions and comments. Yes.
Yeah, I got a question for Maximilian. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could say something about who you think the kind of audience of those exhibitions are. I think in your presentation you're talking a lot about how they're sort of trying to convince the settlers who are actually arriving in or trying to find new lives in the region. Just wondering what you think about whether they're also directed at the kind of wider Polish society elsewhere, and maybe also at kind of the outside world, kind of, and maybe it's possibly it's not even mainly aimed at the actual kind of ordinary settlers. I don't know, just a thought, wondering what you thought about that. Also, I was just thinking, as you were giving the presentation, just about how this was a kind of an originally German building, right, as you said, and they're trying to kind of present a kind of Polish region within a German building. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the kind of tensions there and the kind of the fact that you can do a lot, you can do a lot to kind of Polonize a region in many ways. But if you're not going to kind of change the buildings, they also kind of contain a kind of a cultural kind of baggage to them as well. And I'm just wondering what you thought about that. And if I could just ask one question to the other presenter too. I was just wondering if in the Heimatbriefe there's also any sort of hint of any kind of political sort of content to it. I know that you probably read the book by Demchuk on a similar kind of thing, and he kind of talks about how, you know, the perception that the kind of the expellees were kind of very politically activated, kind of thinking about trying to get these territories back for Germany in a kind of political sense, you know, wasn't really there in the way ordinary expellees thought about this. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you. So, okay, 2, 3 more people.
Thank you. My questions are pretty similar to the ones before. So first one to Maximilian. I very much enjoyed your presentation, the first part. It was, though, not the first time that I heard this diagnosis about the problems with the narrative, which stem, of course, from this nationalistic approach. My question would be, what do we do next with those conclusions, and where does your research, where do you navigate your research? Because you hinted at this 1 million visitors, and I would like to know if you're going also to try to tap into the reception of this exhibition and the impact that it had on people. Is there any place and way to, in your research, to try to deliver or extrapolate, let's say, your conclusions into something more? So this would be my question to Maximilian. And to Cecilia, I think, again, quite a similar question. Of course, you speak about emotional community, and we understand that mostly those emotions are those of nostalgia and loss. What other emotions could you see being developed there? And is there any place for some self-critical, I guess not, but approach and remorse maybe? Thank you.
Proszę Państwa, żeby nie było, że ja się czepiam.
Ladies and gentlemen, not that I'm picking on anyone, but a question to Cecilia, referring to the gentleman's question. Your paper is more sociological than historical, really. So looking into the sources, it's not absolutely necessary, but it would have been actually good to do so. So, referring to these communities of expellees, did you receive it in the political context, as it has been mentioned? And as far as the sources are concerned, did you visit Geibsdorf or Kreislaubahn after 1945 in the Lubain district? And did you look into the archive where there are the letters of the displaced persons and the correspondence and so on?
Thank you, and thanks for several interesting questions. So to respond to Hugo's questions first, the issue of who the audience was, who's coming to see these things, it's been something which, you know, has been a point of discussion in museal circles for a long, long time. In the 19th century, when the first modern public museums were opening, some people wanted them to be for everyone to bring in and to help people better themselves by exposure to culture. Others wanted to close them off as sort of bastions of elite culture. And I think that there was a very determined effort in the Silesian Museum and in Polish museology in general after the Second World War to try and make these places particularly inclusive. And if we think about as well the ideology of the time, a particular effort was made to bring in workers, farmers, soldiers. The museum's Bureau of Social Education actually specifically tried to get these groups in, and they record very carefully what percentage of their visitors come from working class backgrounds. Also children in particular, they want to get children involved. There's a lot of different activities, or promotions, competitions. It's difficult as well, I mean, I think this kind of overlaps to your question as well. It's difficult really to say how people engage with museums. How we work this is a real problem, because on the one hand you have visitor books, but these are notoriously unreliable sources. I mean, I have worked in a museum before, and when I look in the visitor book, people would just sometimes, echo the comment above, and the same thing gets written, brilliant display or whatever. Occasionally you'll get somebody expressing usually dissatisfaction that seems rather more genuine or authentic. But it is difficult. I think that is an issue, and perhaps one of the only ways to do that is through oral history or interviews. There are plenty of pictures of farmers and peasants in boots and overcoats looking at the paintings in the Gallery of Polish Painting, which was propaganda images, but we don't really know exactly how these people related to the images which they saw. You also asked about the building. Now, I think really that's just an issue of practicality. If you think about the level of destruction in Wrocław in 1945, finding a building of a suitable size and not too badly damaged. It was in a state of considerable disrepair, but they were able to rather quickly put it together. So, I mean, perhaps there is an ideological aspect to reclaiming a former Prussian government building, but I think it really was just a practical consideration. Now, as to your question as to where my work fits in, I think what it is, it's situated in this context of Stalinist Poland, but what it's more about is the role that museums play in the nation-building process. As I said, or I alluded to in my talk, museums haven't really, or museology hadn't really taken off until the 1980s. Before that, really, museology consisted of articles on how to put together an effective exhibition, what you should do. It was all practical. No one had really historicized the museum as an institution. And so this new museology that emerged in the 1980s was certainly a salutary move, but I'm not sure it really does quite capture what museums do, or certainly I take issue with some of the literature. But I think it's increasingly clear that the connection between the modern public museum, which emerges over the course of the 19th century, and the development of modernity, but also of nationalism. And I think museums and nationalism are very closely bound together. And of course, at the moment, we're seeing this is what originally got me into the subject. We're seeing a lot of discussions about museums, what should be in them, what should we do, how are we presenting narratives. And I think if we want to understand this discussion properly, it's absolutely vital that we historicize these institutions and understand where they came from and how they developed and what roles they served in the past. It's not enough to just think about now, we have to understand the past as well. So I hope that answers your questions. And
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. So there was, of course, some political contents too in this round brief, but what I wanted to show is that I think that through the years, these small emotional, that's why also I call them emotional community, they really differentiated themselves from these, like the rhetoric of victimization or this narration that the political organizations of the ex-police, the Landmannschaften and all these things, so they really differentiated from them. And so the point was that people were not, I think many people did not feel represented by these organizational, political organizations. That's why I wanted to point out how these communities were more emotional than political. But of course, sometimes they talk also about political problems. They also, this depends a lot from also the pastors, because these letters were also very personal. So each pastor could write more or less whatever they wanted. So the evangelical church was very, so it tried to push the expellees and to go on, to look forward, not to feel nostalgia, not to feel too much the desire to go back. So they were not political, but of course each pastor had their own idea. So we can see this from, because I presented today just one case, but I took three cases for my PhD thesis, and I compared them, and they were very different. I mean, Pastor Zalfeld, for example, was more political than the others. Yeah. And for the other question, I've never been to Geifsdorf, but because it was like a fate that I found. What?
The Polish name.
Yeah. No, it's not because I don't want, it's just because it's difficult for me to pronounce, sorry. And, but I really want to, so the point is that it was just really a little case study in my, so in all my work, and I found these letters. I was really lucky, I have to say. I found these letters in this Evangelical Central Archive in Berlin, but these were some letters of many others, and so I saw this conference, and I thought I will present the case of Silesian here, because I think it could be interesting. But yeah, I really would like to go on these three cities that I selected and go in the archives there, because it's really important. So this is just a little part of what could be there, and maybe there will be more letters and correspondences, and also I think it will be interesting not to see just these religious sources, but also a point of view of people who were not religious, for example, because I just saw the evangelical people. So yeah, this could be also an interesting evolution of my research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for both perspectives, the grassroots perspective and the top-down perspective that we had. And I would also, if I may comment on both presentations, perhaps it would be interesting to broaden this comparative aspect, not only to people religious and not religious, but also to look for other communities of migrants or expellees. For example, I have found far away in Connecticut a small emotional community of the Polish former displaced persons who settled down in various places in the world, totally lay. I mean, there was a lay female leader, let's say, self-nominated leader of this community, Mrs. Eva Gierat, who initiated a kind of curricular letter. So she was writing a letter and wrote a list of names to whom this letter should be delivered one by one, and everybody added their news. And after some time, this letter with all the additions was coming back to her, and she summarized the findings in the following letter, and it went on and on. And today there are several boxes of such curriculars. So it's also another example of this emotional community where there were people of different political views and aspirations, etc., but there was this emotional ties that united them. And as for the museum, and also a little bit maybe answering your question, the period of Stalinism in Poland was so close that I don't think that any outside audiences, I mean international audiences, could be taken into consideration. And my comment or question or things to consider would be about this tension between communism and nationalism. Which one was really genuine, whether they were communists who pretended to be nationalists in order to gain popular support, or whether they they were nationalists with some communist ideology in order to get the Soviet support. So that's maybe the question to consider. Thank you very much for the session. And now I'm giving the mic to Professor Grzegorz Chryciuk.
Proszę Państwa, nie ma tego w programie, ale
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is not put in the agenda, but the organizers of our conference actually revealed kind heart, and under the pretense of a technical break, have given you 5 minutes of a break. But the bad news is the coffee coming in 90 minutes only.